Snow Angels by Harriet Loveday. Fly away with me on my sleigh. Jim stood in front of the check-in desk at Edinburgh Airport, trying to take in what the lady behind the desk was saying. She was about 5'7", with blonde hair, neatly twisted up in a bun, and green hazel eyes. She had a prominent nose and a soft, long face. She had just the right amount of curve to her body. She seemed nice, so he didn't want to be cross, but clearly there was some mistake. Jim leant forward and looked at her name badge. "Carly," he said in his deep, resonant voice and Scottish accent, "clearly there has been some mistake. I'm meeting my friends here for a stag do in Dublin this weekend. Could you check again?" Carly looked at the tall, at least 6 feet, man in front of her. He was good looking in a slim Captain America sort of way. He had lovely blue eyes, a long face with laughter lines, and brown hair which was trimmed quite short over the back and sides. His arms were thick and muscly, and he had slim, muscly legs. He was wearing jeans and a fitted check shirt. She watched him run his hand over his face in stress. Carly had had a few difficult customers today, but she could sympathise with this man. He seemed nice. Smiling kindly, she said, "Mr. Angus, I do understand your frustration, but this ticket is booked for the 17:45 flight to Dublin for Thursday the 17th of December. Today is the 16th of December. You are 1 day early." Carly could see that the queue behind the man wasn't too long, and her colleague beside her was also checking passengers in for the 17:45 flight. She could give him a little of her time and help. Besides, the man looked stressed and disappointed. Carly tried to help him further. "Do you have the name of one of your fellow passengers?" "Fraser McLean," Jim promptly replied. Carly typed the details into her computer and checked the flights for the 17th of December. Looking up to Jim, she said, "Mr. Fraser McLean has a seat on tomorrow's flight. I'm sorry. There are seats on today's flight, so you can take the flight today or stay on tomorrow's flight with the rest of the party." Jim knew he needed to make a quick decision. He didn't have accommodation in Dublin for tonight, as they'd booked the shared flat, and clearly that wouldn't be ready until tomorrow now. He also wanted to be with the crowd and to share the excitement of the flight over. The trouble was, he'd travelled nearly 4 hours to get here today, and so he certainly didn't want to repeat that journey. He'd just have to find accommodation for tonight in Edinburgh and meet with the guys tomorrow. Smiling gratefully, he said, "I'm an idiot. Can you keep me on the flight tomorrow, Thursday the 17th of December? Thank you. Can you check me in now?" Carly met his eyes and smiled back. "Yes, I can check you in now, sir. You can drop your bags off tomorrow before the flight." She started typing in his details. "Mr. James Angus." She smiled at his passport photo. He seemed nice. "Please, call me Jim," Jim said. Carly flicked her eyes up to him. Their eyes connected. Carly flushed slightly and dropped her eyes back to the computer screen, schooling herself. "Keep professional, Carly. He's just a passenger passing through. Do your job." Smiling and printing off Jim's details, she handed them to him and said, "You were checked in for the 17:45 flight, Thursday the 17th of December. Please leave at least an hour to drop your bags off before your flight." Jim smiled back at her and gratefully took his documents. "Thanks, Carly," he said. Her heart did a little flutter. Carly had had a long day. Her feet were tired from standing in heels all day. She was looking forward to going home and having a hot shower and something to eat. It was nearly 8 in the evening, and most of the passengers had left for their destinations now. Some of her colleagues were still busy. Some travellers were wandering around looking lost. The airport never really slept. It just got a bit quieter overnight. Carly had Sunday and Monday off, not so far away. Perhaps she'd do some last-minute Christmas shopping. Carly's mind busied with thoughts of this and that. Planning, organising, lists, work stress. She slipped on her coat, tied the belt, grabbed her navy suede gloves and neat leather handbag, and started to make her way through the airport to the car park and her car to go home. As Carly passed by Ye Olde pub in the middle of the terminal, she was surprised to see Jim sat at one of the high tables, a half-drunk lager in front of him. He was reading a book. Just as she was about to walk on, he looked up from his book, caught her eye, smiled and shrugged. Smiling in reply, she wandered over. "Hi again," he said. "Hi, you didn't stay in town?" Carly asked. Jim gave an exaggerated exhale and raised his eyebrows good-humouredly. "Apparently there's a climate conference on. After about an hour, I gave up trying to find a room. I'll just skip on some of the seats tonight and go to Edinburgh tomorrow to use up time before the flight. Oh no, you're not having much luck with your journey, she sympathised. Bravely, Jim said, I always seem to be a bit luckier around you, and nervously laughed. Carly smiled, blushed, and looked at her feet. Hey, Jim continued, I was about to have some dinner. Do you want to join me? As a thank you for helping me out today. Carly couldn't help herself. Despite being tired, she absolutely did want to have dinner with him. Thank you, yes, although I didn't do so much, you know. Jim smiled, packed up his book and put his phone in his back pocket, collected his rucksack and lager, and directed them to a quiet corner of the pub. Carly and Jim got on brilliantly. Carly forgot to be tired and Jim forgot to be bored. They covered all sorts of subjects: Jim's job, he was an engineer, siblings, where Jim and Carly lived, where they came from, schools, universities. Jim was most impressed to find that Carly spoke 2 languages, Spanish and German. They enjoyed a meal of fish and chips and talked until the staff at the pub chucked them out. Jim even suggested that they get a coffee, but it was getting late and Carly had to work tomorrow, so reluctantly she declined. So you're working here again tomorrow, Jim said. Yes, my next day off is Sunday, Carly replied. Perhaps I could meet you for lunch tomorrow then, if you're around, he ventured. Carly smiled shyly. Okay, that would be nice. Carly and Jim smiled at each other and Carly's heart made tiny backflips. Jim kept his word and took Carly to lunch the next day. She only had 50 minutes, so the conversation was a little more direct. I'm guessing you don't have a boyfriend then, as you're having lunch with me, Jim asked. Carly blushed. I don't have a boyfriend. I've actually had a fairly awful time with guys, lots of disastrous relationships. Jim pulled his eyebrows together in concern. But you're gorgeous. Then he stopped and smiled. He'd said too much, but bravely ploughed on. I mean, I can't understand why a guy wouldn't treat you like a princess. Carly looked sad. I just seem to attract guys that seem nice and turn out to be mean. Mean to me, that is. She sighed. I just don't have much luck with guys, that's all. Jim tried to cheer her up. I think that's their fault if they don't appreciate you, not yours. Hey, just for the record, I think you're great. Carly blushed at the compliment. Thank you. Then mustering her courage, she asked, so what about you? Why are you single? Jim sighed and summed it up with, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. He set his mouth to an upside-down smile. It'll be great to be with the guys this weekend, but I'm the only one in the group who's still single. Everyone in my friendship group from university is happily settled too. It just hasn't seemed to have worked out that way for me. Carly tried to cheer him up. Hey, it's better to be single than with the wrong person. Jim shrugged his shoulders as he said, yes, I know it. Just living it can be a little lonely sometimes. He tried to lighten the mood. Do you want some pudding? He asked. Spying the clock at the corner of the eatery, Carly said, I'm sorry, I can't. I've got to get back. Thank you so much for lunch and dinner last night. You didn't have to. Do you want me to split the bill? Not at all. It's my pleasure, Jim replied, standing up with her. He gulped heavily and said, perhaps, and it's perfectly okay to say no. Would you be okay if I took your number? Carly smiled and gave it to him. Then nodding their goodbyes and joking that they might see each other later, Carly left. Jim certainly did see Carly later. This time he was surrounded by a group of noisy, boisterous guys. As the group queued for the check-in desks and bag drop, Jim made sure that his bags were checked in by Carly, even though the guys teased him about it. Hello again, Carly said, smiling. Hey, Jim said, winking, as he passed her his passport and boarding pass that she printed out for him yesterday. Behind him, the guys cheered. Carly blushed and felt quite self-conscious. Jim had clearly said something to them about taking her to dinner and lunch. With so much testosterone around, Carly started to feel a little intimidated. As she tapped Jim's details into the computer and moved his rucksack along the conveyor belt, she tried to focus on doing her job efficiently. All the while, she was aware of Jim looking at her intently. Glancing up at Jim, she smiled and passed him back his passport and boarding pass with his baggage sticker attached. Have a lovely flight and time in Dublin, she said. As long as it's as nice as the day I've just had, then it will be great. He looked intently at her. Carly smiled and Jim moved to the side so that she and her colleague could continue checking in the high-spirited group of men. When the queue had gone and she had time for some reflection, Carly felt a little sad. That was it then. Jim would be returning Sunday and she was off on Sunday. Perhaps he'd call her, but he was off to have fun with the guys. By the time Sunday came around, she'd be no more than a fleeting memory. Something that could have been. Carly's colleague, Debbie, leant over from behind her check-in desk and said in a loud whisper, "That guy in the check shirt was a complete hunk, and he was checking you out. Did you see?" Carly shook her head sadly and said, "I've got a story for you. Do you want a cup of tea?" "Excellent idea." Both ladies placed the closed sign on their desks and made their way round the back to the tea room. "Well," Debbie said, clutching her still warm, empty teacup and helping herself to another custard cream from the tin. "He seems a little better than the normal oglers, and he bought you dinner twice. I like him." Carly waved her phone at her friend. The screen was blank. "Except he's taken my number and no messages yet." Debbie proclaimed, "Have you really shown him you're interested? Perhaps you need to bump into him sometime. Then he'll remember how lovely you are." "I can't stalk him," Carly replied, horrified. "No, but you know when his flight back is. How many air miles have you got? Plus, Sunday's late flight still has seats and you've got the day off. You could take the morning flight to Dublin, do some shopping, and happen to take the same flight back. That's not stalking, that's coincidence." Carly pursed her lips together. "Don't suppose you're free Sunday?" she asked. "Nope. Family lunch." Debbie rolled her eyes in anticipation of it. "Besides, he doesn't want 2 women. He just wants 1. Carly retorted, "A stag do in Dublin. I expect he'll be getting an eyeful of lots of women all weekend." "Yeah, but I bet he doesn't ask them to dinner." Carly sighed as Debbie continued. "Just think about it, okay? You have those air miles by burning a hole in your pocket. It's just thought." Carly stood in front of the book stand at the end of the terminal, waiting for her flight Sunday morning. Part of her felt silly and part of her felt excited. Was she mad to be doing this? Debbie had suggested it, so it must be all right. The problem was that her relationships always ended badly. Part of her didn't want the pain again, and part of her was ever hopeful that true love and romance existed, that it was still waiting for her around that ever-elusive corner. Carly ran her eyes over the bookshelf as the title caught her eye. "Single Women, Get the Guy." Intrigued, Carly picked up and read the blurb on the back. "Always the bridesmaid, never the bride. Alice Evans is one of the UK's top dating experts, and using a mixture of psychology, biology, and her extensive dating knowledge as an agony aunt for the Daily Prophet, she outlines her 5-step programme for attracting the right man and navigating the early stages of a relationship. Reviewers call this book, funny how fate has a way of leaving breadcrumbs along the trail to the right path." Clutching the book, Carly felt this was the perfect book to accompany her on her adventure. Paying for her purchase, she heard the boarding call for her gate and rushed to join the queue of passengers to Dublin. It was cold outside on the tarmac at Edinburgh Airport. She didn't have much luggage, just a large bucket bag, and being airport staff, she'd been moved to the spare seat at the front of the plane before the dividing curtains to first class. So, while the other passengers struggled on board with their bags, passed down the narrow aisle, Carly wiggled her bottom on her seat, got comfy, and opened the first page of the book. Carly was engrossed. It was somewhere over the Irish Sea that she read the haunting words of Chapter 3. "Don't chase, men hunt." Carly furrowed her eyebrows and shifted uncomfortably on her seat as she craned her head in closer to the text. "The biggest mistake the modern woman makes is chasing a man. Ladies, I'm telling you, no. Don't do this. Men need to hunt. If you chase, then he has you without effort, and you have diminished your value. Men need to feel they've won. What if he doesn't chase you? You may ask. Sadly, ladies, if he doesn't chase, then he doesn't value you, and it was merely flirting. Pick up your precious heart and move on. The intensity of the hunt tells you about his feelings for you. The longer than the hunt, then the more he is able to develop feelings for you. This is your warning. Do not chase men. Let them hunt you." Carly reread the chapter several times to be sure she really understood what the author was trying to tell her. In essence, Carly was supposed to, sit and do nothing? And if she was on the flight back from Dublin, then she was easy? Jim wouldn't value her? She'd be putting herself on the discard pile. A cold shiver went up Carly's back. She needed to get off this flight. Carly looked out of the window onto the grey Irish Sea below her. She needed to book a different flight back. As soon as she landed, she'd go to the check-in desk and get the next flight back to Edinburgh. Holding tightly to the closed book, Carly thanked her lucky stars she read this in time. Finding this book was a stroke of good luck. She could have spoilt everything. That is, if anything was ever destined to happen. Carly looked at Michelle. She was always on the phone to Michelle. They'd been on some of the same training schools together. "Could you check again?" Carly pleaded. Michelle moved aside for Carly to see her screen, and as she said, "I'm sorry, it's overbooked. I think it's due to people travelling back for Christmas and needing ongoing transport at the other end. Some of the ones that don't make this flight will probably be on your 2037 flight this evening. I'm sorry, Carly. There's nothing I can do." Carly sighed inwardly and resigned herself to the fact that she really was making a complete mess of this. She wished she'd never come. She wished she'd read the book before talking to Debbie, but it wasn't Debbie's fault, it was hers. Messed up, upside-down relationships. Her New Year's resolution would be to get a relationship counsellor and sort this all out. "It's okay, Michelle. It's not your fault," Carly said. "I'll get the 2037 flight as booked." "Are you off into Dublin?" Michelle asked. "I've kind of lost the heart for it now. I think I'll stay here and read my book," Carly replied. "Don't suppose you fancy catching up for lunch and a chat," Michelle said. "Do you know, that would be nice," Carly replied. She was glad of her friends. Carly had enjoyed her lunch with Michelle, and over lunch spilled the beans as to why she was here, and that, although it had been Debbie's idea, she'd gone with it, but changed her mind. Carly brought out the book and showed Michelle. Michelle read the back of the book, looked at Carly thoughtfully, and placing a hand on her arm, told her not to worry. After lunch, Carly found a nice quiet corner and spent the afternoon eating chocolate croissants, drinking cafe lattes, and reading her book. She had reached the final chapter when she heard the call for her flight back to Edinburgh. What a fruitless day, she thought to herself. Now her only job was to make sure that Jim didn't see her on the flight home. Skirting around the crew at the gate, Carly was aware of a group of boisterous, tired, noisy men near one of the confectionery dispensers. Carly tried not to look as she talked to some of her colleagues and left the gate to board the flight before the other passengers. Once again, she was in first class, distinguished by the curtain dividing the first 3 rows of the plane. When she boarded the plane, she wrapped herself up in a blanket, turned her head towards the dark window, and hoped to goodness Jim didn't recognise her. Carly heard the other passengers starting to board and resolutely kept her head towards the window. On and on they came. To try and distract herself, Carly pulled out the book and huddled up to the window, waiting for the flight to depart. From the front of the plane, she could hear, "But there must be some mistake. I'm in first class," said the man's angry voice. "I'm sorry, sir, but this ticket clearly places you in seat 17D. You will need to move on down the aisle," replied the calm voice of the steward. "But I paid for this," the angry man said again. "I appreciate that, sir. However, the flight is very full. You can return to the gate, or you can take this flight. The seat you have been allocated is 17D. I will warn you, the next flight to Edinburgh is tomorrow morning," said the steward. "But I checked my tickets. I was allocated seat 2B. I don't see when this mix-up could have happened. Let me tell you that as soon as I arrive in Edinburgh, I will be making a complaint to the airline," said the angry man. "Absolutely, sir. I perfectly understand. If you would be so kind as to take your seat, other passengers are boarding," the steward replied. Behind the angry man, Carly could hear the noisy group of men stomping up the steps. She shrunk under her blanket a little further and intently stared at her book. One by one, the noisy men filed past Carly and proceeded to fill up the seats around 17D. "Hello," a familiar voice said beside her. Fearfully, Carly popped her head up from her book and met the kind blue eyes of Jim. Carly flushed bright red. Jim continued, "I'm sorry, it seems there's been a mix-up with the seats. I think I've got the seat next to you." Carly looked up in horror at the seat name, 2B. "Oh, of course," Carly replied, sitting up straight and trying to keep her composure. "I didn't expect to see you on my flight," Jim said. Carly flushed harder. "There were some spare seats and I decided to do a little Christmas shopping, as Dublin is so lovely." Trying to cover her tracks, she said, "It's a perk of the job. We take flights all the time," she said. "Oh, yes, I bet. I never really thought about that. So what did you buy?" Jim asked. Books mainly, for the family." Carly hastily and surreptitiously stowed her book, Single Woman Get the Guy, into her bag and kicked the bag under the seat in front of her. "Oh, nice." Jim furrowed his brow, thinking Dublin was quite a long way to buy some books. Forging on, he said, "I'm sorry I didn't text or anything. It's been a busy weekend." Carly smiled politely. No, not at all. I hope you had fun. Yeah, Jim replied. It's been wild. From somewhere back in the cabin, Carly could hear some men chanting some sort of stag-do song, almost as if it were a ritual rite of passage. The aircrew at the front of the plane started making their initial checks and reviewing the passenger on board list. From behind Carly and Jim, one of Jim's friends came up the aisle and said, Hey, mate, I think there's been a mix-up in the seats. There's a guy with us, and he said you've got his seat. Jim looked up and said, Oh, really? Yeah, mate, he's getting a bit grumpy. I said you'd be okay to move. Jim thought about it and said, Nope, pretty sure this is the right seat. Jim's friend looked at him strangely, then looked over to Carly, his eyebrows raising with recognition. Then he looked back to Jim and said, smiling, No problems, mate. I just thought I'd check. Jim and the friend exchanged a nod as the friend retreated back down the aisle. Jim looked sideways at Carly and said, Seems there's been a lot of muddle-ups over seats. He raised his eyebrows. Carly was mortified and blushed harder. Yes. Inside, all she could think was, Michelle. She'd need to have a serious word with her and Debbie when she got back into work Tuesday. For now, she just had to navigate sitting next to this gorgeous guy and not chase him. How on earth was she to show that she was interested by not being interested? This was a pickle. Carly decided to say nothing at all. Jim shut off his phone. The plane taxied along the runway and took off. Still, Carly said nothing. Jim took out his book. The confectionery trolley came around. Leaning over, Sarah, the air stewardess, said to Carly, On the house, and passed her 2 half bottles of champagne and 2 plastic flutes. Jim gratefully received his orange juice from the air stewardess. Then, turning to Carly as Sarah departed, he said, Blimey, you really do get some perks. He started laughing. Carly looked embarrassed. She said, I don't think I could manage to. Would you like one? Well, considering my liver has had a bit of a workout this weekend, why not? Jim replied. Jim opened the champagne for them and poured it into the flutes. He proposed a taste, saying, wasn't it lucky they'd met on the flight? And as the bubbles met their bloodstreams, Carly relaxed and they spent the rest of the flight chatting. By the time Carly and Jim reached the airport in Edinburgh, it was almost as if it were Thursday all over again. Carly and Jim disembarked first. As he waited for his friends to alight, Jim said, Hey, it really has been great getting to know you. I have your number. I promise I will definitely text. Thank you. I look forward to it. That would be nice, Carly replied with a smile. Boldly, perhaps it was the champagne they'd just consumed at altitude, Jim leant forward and kissed Carly on the cheek. See you around, eh? He said. Carly smiled and said, Yes, see you around. Her heart felt like fluttering tissue paper in the breeze, but with the words of Alice Evans's advice still burning into her eyes, she knew she needed to exit, and quickly. She needed to leave him wanting more. Smiling up at him and mentally saying goodbye, because there was always a chance that he was flirting and this wasn't a hunt for him, Carly prepared herself to never see Jim again. As she turned around and calmly made her way out of the airport to the car park and her car. Carly was busy over the next week, reuniting passengers with loved ones and trying to get them home. She had lunch with her mum on Christmas Day. Boxing Day, she was back into work to mop up the debris of missed and delayed flights over Christmas. Her phone remained empty. No texts, no calls from Jim. Carly sighed. Well, as Alice Evans had said, better to know it was just flirting and move on gracefully than to chase and be treated poorly. In all Carly's relationships, she had been treated poorly and she didn't want the heartache of that again. But Jim had seemed so nice. Carly sighed again. That's just the way it was. She had to accept it. It was Wednesday the 30th of December. Debbie was in work. Carly had already talked about the Dublin trip and found that Debbie and Michelle had been in cahoots to make sure it worked out for Carly. They were equally disappointed that Jim hadn't texted or called. Carly had even shown Debbie the book, but Debbie dismissed it as codswallop and said that when men fall in love, they just know. But Jim hadn't fallen in love, had he? He hadn't even sent Carly a Happy Christmas text. Carly started checking in the passengers of the day. Debbie, next to her, was like a can of Mexican jumping beans. It was even worse when Laura, on Carly's opposite shift, turned up. Apparently there'd been a mix-up in the rotors. Laura hung around and offered to help out now that she was in, but Carly insisted that she rest up, particularly as she was 4 months pregnant. Tapping away at the computer at the check-in counter, Carly was most surprised to see, further down the queue, Jim, with his puffer jacket under his arm, his checked shirt stretched over his muscly chest and a big grin. He was looking back at her. Carly tried to remain professional and continued to check in passengers. When Jim's turn came in the queue, he insisted on waiting for Carly rather than Debbie. Standing in front of Carly's desk, Jim said, "Check in for 2, please." Carly looked puzzled and leant around to look behind him. Do you have their passport?" she said. "I think all you need is a driving licence." He pushed the flight details and his passport over the counter towards her. It was a return flight to London for today, for himself and Carly. Carly looked at the documents and pulled her eyebrows together. This was all very strange. Behind her, she could hear Laura back from the tea room. From behind her, Laura said, Mr. Angus, so good to speak to you on the phone. I assume the ticket details are correct?" Jim replied, "Yes, all correct. Many thanks to yourself and Debbie." From the corner of her eye, Carly could see a little half-smile on Debbie's face as she checked in the next passenger. Carly looked around to Laura, confused, as Laura gently moved Carly out from her seat, logged her off the system, logged herself in, and proceeded to check in Carly and Jim for the next flight to London. Handing Jim their boarding passes, Laura said, "Boarding is in 50 minutes, departure gate 5. Carly stood open-mouthed as Jim turned to her and said, "Fly away with me?" Blushing, Carly replied, "Yes."